Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Woody Register. I'm the director of the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation here at Sewanee. I'm also a professor of history, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. A few words first, however. There's one thing I always forget to do, and that's to thank the people and organizations that help us bring Mr. Cellini to campus today. First, always the University Lectures Committee, very generous in its sharing its funding with us, the Office of Civic Engagement, the Southern Studies Program, and the American Studies Program. Thank you all for your contributions to this lecture. Because this is our first event of the year, first official event for the Roberson Project, I want to take a moment just to explain a little why we are now going by the title, the Roberson Project. As I hope all of you know, or many of you know, until recently we have been calling ourselves the Sewanee Project on on slavery, race, and reconciliation. As of the beginning of this term, however, we have changed our official name to the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation to honor and to memorialize our late friend and colleague and teacher here in the college, Houston Brian Roberson. Houston Roberson, Dr. Roberson, died in December 2016 and left he left behind him an enormous impact on our campus and a tremendous hole in the hearts of those who loved him and love him still. Dr. Roberson was the first descendant from slaves hired to teach in a tenure-track position in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of the South. He arrived here in 1997. Dr. Roberson was also the first descendant of slaves to be granted tenure at the university. And Dr. Roberson also was the first scholar hired full-time by the university whose expertise was in his African American history. So he had a dramatic and lasting impact on the curriculum. Think about this, 1997, that's only what, 130 plus years after emancipation, after the end of the Civil War. So his arrival at Sewanee was really started a new era in the college. But beyond that, Houston's joy, Houston's love of teaching, his devotion to his students, his extraordinary contributions as a scholar of African American religion and African American churches, and the deep care that he brought to everything that he did here in Sewanee. These were also his lasting contributions. So speaking for those of us involved with the project and those of us in the larger community who are supportive of the work that we've done, it is a deep and rewarding honor to be able to take on this name, to call ourselves the Roberson Project henceforth. We'll be having more to say about that in the year to come. More ways to mark, to recognize this change, which for us is not a change in focus. It is rather a kind of a renewal of purpose and mission for the work that we are doing. So thank you for allowing me to explain that. I imagine I'll do it in a little more concise form in ensuing events that we have this year. Now about our speaker, Mr. Richard Cellini. Last January there was a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I can't remember who brought it to my attention, but it landed on my, my virtual desktop almost immediately after it appeared on the Chronicle online. And it was, the title of it was How Universities Can Respond to Their Slavery Ties by Mr. Richard J. Cellini. Now, the first thing, I had a kind of initial visceral reaction to this article. First, and I apologize for my vanity here, or my institutional vanity, Mr. Cellini he mentioned that 24 American colleges and universities have begun investigating their institutional ties to slavery. And then he listed 9 or 10 institutions that have begun that. Sewanee was not one of those. I was miffed, let me say. Okay, and I don't know what that says about me, but it's true about me. I was miffed first. But then I read on, and frankly was both provoked and captivated by what Mr. Cellini had to say. The way in which he was in this article, as he often is in his public remarks, pointedly critical of universities and colleges for their institutional studies, and especially for their failure, their refusal, their inattention to investigate what he calls the Descendent Factor. And there was no one who came under greater criticism, no institution that came under greater criticism than these were in this article, than his own alma mater, Georgetown University. So let me give you some quick background on the Georgetown situation that ties it a bit to our own history. In 1838, Georgetown College, what we now Georgetown University, sold more than 200 of the women, children, and men whom the university enslaved on its Maryland plantations to raise badly needed funds to fend off bankruptcy. The college was in a crisis. They sold them from the Maryland plantations to planters in Louisiana. These enslaved persons who were sold are now known as GU 272, the GU 272. This brought a small amount of cash to Georgetown, which enabled it to remain open, to prosper, and ultimately to become the great kind of global institution that it is today. Now, one of the major purchasing planters for this initial sale that saved Georgetown was Henry Johnson in Louisiana, Henry Johnson. Later, the governor, a congressman, and one of the largest, there were several of these, benefactors in the founding of our own University of the South 20 years later, 20 years after that Georgetown sale. He pledged $40,000 to the new University of the South, a gargantuan figure. Now, in 2015, Georgetown University appointed a study group to address this sale and its impact on the university and what steps it ought to take to redress the harm that it did. But when its recommendations were issued the next year, our speaker today, Richard Cellini, himself a Georgetown graduate, an attorney practicing in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he quickly emerged as an outspoken critic of Georgetown's response, principally for the ways in which the university paid almost no attention, expressed almost no concern for the descendants of the GU 272. In Richard's words in this article, he said, Georgetown's official response to a slaveholding past was stingy, unimaginative, and largely focused on the university itself. So that attitude, thanks to the work of Mr. Cellini and others, was soon forced to change. He founded the Georgetown Memory Project, which was a crowdfunding initiative that set about identifying the descendants of the GU 272. The university had maintained that hardly any of the enslaved persons that it sold to Louisiana survived, or it survived an epidemic. On the contrary, Mr. Cellini discovered there was no mass death, and to date, his project has identified, I don't know what the number is now, but more than 8,000 deceased and living descendants of the GU 272. And as a result of his organization's work, Georgetown has had to acknowledge this large legacy population of the original sale and to include them in all considerations of how the university should respond to its history. Also, as a result of this work, universities and other American institutions that directly benefited from the labor of enslaved people now have to consider what Mr. Cellini calls the descendant factor. So Mr. Cellini has emerged as one of the most influential national voices in the discussion of how colleges and universities that benefited from slavery should address the legacy populations of those they enslaved or benefited from their enslavement. And his insights are especially relevant to our own institution, our own university. Most obvious, the cause of founding the University of the South was aided materially and socially by a slaveholder whose wealth was tied to the GU 272 sale, Henry Johnson. But in addition, our project has identified more than 140 of its pre-Civil War benefactors who together held more than 30,000 persons in bondage. There are another 130 or so whom we have not confidently identified yet, but we can well imagine, it's not beyond the possibility, that those who pledged their wealth to the founding of this university held between 50 and 60,000 persons in bondage at the end of the 1850s, that is just prior to the Civil War. So we might well ask and consider most seriously our own potential indebtedness to the descendants of the women, children, and men enslaved by the University of the South's original organizers and benefactors. The University of the South, in other words, must be part of this conversation about remedies and reparations. We too must consider the descendant factor, and I'm confident that Mr. Cellini agrees with me. Now, Mr. Cellini graduated from Georgetown with a bachelor's degree in 1984 and a law degree in 1988. He is truly a product of that university. He also received a master's degree from the University of Cambridge in 1994. He's worked as a senior executive in the high technology industry in New England for the past 25 years. He is not a trained historian, a professional historian, but let me tell you, he knows his history. So for his work with the Georgetown Memory Project, he was named to the Chronicle of Higher Education's 10 Most Influential list in 2016. Last year, he received the Frederick Douglass Service Award of the Sons and Daughters of the U.S. Middle Passage. This is the nation's leading lineage society for the descendants of persons enslaved in America. In 2019, this year, he was elected to serve as a counselor of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, a very respected name, the most respected name in family history. We are very fortunate to have him here. When I read that article, I took it as a challenge, and I said, we need to bring this man to Sewanee. So please welcome Richard Cellini this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I particularly want to thank Dr. Register for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm tempted to conclude, or to suggest that we adjourn the proceedings right now before the prosecution gets a chance to make its case, but that was a very generous introduction. It is an honor to be here at Sewanee, the University of the South. This is a great and storied university, and I thank you for inviting me. Just a little bit of personal history. I went to Georgetown College and Georgetown Law School. I love Georgetown very much, but as a freshman in 1980, I distinctly remember complaining to the dean of Georgetown College that Georgetown just didn't feel traditional enough to me, and his advice immediately was, Mr. Cellini, you should transfer to the University of the South. It's taken me some 40 years, but I have finally gotten here. And he's right. There's much to recommend this university, and I like it here very much. People have been very hospitable. On to my subject. My subject today, as the slides show, is slavery and the old school tie, shouldering responsibility for alma mater's role in the slave trade. Together, and I do mean together because we'll have lots of chance and opportunity for Q&A and interjections, I'd like us to try to answer, not just ask, but answer the hard question. What should the present do for future generations to mitigate the sins of alma maters past? My presentation will have three parts. First, I'd like to tell you a story. I'd like to tell you a story about a particular group of people enslaved by a particular university, and that university's particular efforts to grapple and atone with its past. Second, I'd like to offer some general observations about universities and slavery reparations. And finally, I'd like to conclude with some brief remarks and recommendations tailored to the truly unique history, traditions, and charism of the University of the South. Let's begin with the story. In late 2015, the Georgetown Memory Project uncovered an entirely new slavery narrative, and if I may say, it was a narrative of great scope, depth, and beauty. It's a narrative about a group of people who were despised in life and almost completely forgotten in death. It's a story of privilege and poverty, white and black, north and south, faith and betrayal, and good and evil. It's both a mystery and a morality tale. It's a story about a group of people once enslaved by Georgetown University, but really it's a story about all of us. It's a story about American slavery and the people and the American lives that were ruined by slavery. And it's a reminder of just how much of our modern world is built on those ruined lives. Our story starts in 1634, when Catholicism arrived in North America, specifically when an order of Catholic priests known as the Jesuits arrived in southern Maryland. Now, when the Jesuits landed in America, they brought indentured servants with them, and they probably acquired African American slaves shortly thereafter. When the Jesuits settled in Maryland, they built and operated plantations. There were 5 plantations in all. These were tobacco plantations, but more important, they were slave plantations. These plantations were operated for the sole purpose of funding the mission of the Jesuit order in North America. Now, between 1634 and 1864, a period of almost 250 years, the Jesuits enslaved, in the aggregate, more than 1,000 people on these plantations. The Jesuits actually still own many of these properties today. In the 1740s, the Jesuits decided to establish the first Catholic university in America. It's the university today known as Georgetown University. For almost 50 years, the Jesuits operated their Maryland slave plantations primarily for the purpose of collecting enough money to build and open the college at Georgetown. Georgetown College finally admitted its first student in 1791, and all of Georgetown's earliest buildings were built by slaves. For the next 50 years, Georgetown's operating costs were covered entirely with revenue generated from the 5 Jesuit slave plantations. In fact, Georgetown itself owned and kept slaves on its college campus. In many ways, Georgetown was actually really the 6th plantation. Until the mid-1830s, Georgetown educated students for free. No tuition was charged. Who were those lucky students? Well, you can guess. They were young, white, Catholic men, and they were mostly the sons of wealthy Southern planters and slave owners. Basically, over a period of more than 100 years, Georgetown was founded, built, and operated entirely with funds generated by slave labor. 1,000 men, women, and children, all of them baptized Roman Catholics. The Jesuits called them the family. By the mid-1830s, Georgetown was actually on the verge of financial collapse, so the Jesuits decided to sell their slaves outright for cash. On June 19th of 1838, the Maryland Jesuits signed a written agreement to sell what was described as 272 men, women, and children, and they were sold for a total of $115,000 in 1838 money. That's about, it's difficult to make these sort of these antebellum conversions, but that's about $3.3 million in today's money, or it's about 3.3 billion with a B if you add in compound interest and compute it at a rate of about 6% a year. And I chose that figure because it's not a fanciful figure. In the $115,000 was paid in installments over a period of 25 years, and it was paid at a rate of 6% per annum. So that's actually a contemporary figure. The sale agreement pictured here is 8 pages long. Almost the entire agreement, other than a few preambles at the beginning and some perfunctory stuff at the end, is actually a list of names. Each and every one of the enslaved people is listed by name, gender, and age. 50% of them were children. William was just 6 months old. Daniel was more than 80. 3 men were named Nace. This name is short for Ignatius, the founder of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit orders. Len was sickly. Stephen was lame. Betsy was married to Sam. In the end, the Jesuits sold actually a total of 314 enslaved people during a 5-year period covering 1838 to 1843. The sale did not happen just on a single day, and it did not actually involve just 272 people who were mentioned in the preamble. It actually took place over a 5-year period and involved a total of 314 enslaved people. But collectively, they're known today as the GU 272. The GU 272 were sent to 3 different sugar plantations in southern Louisiana. As Dr. Register has already described, one of the plantations was actually owned by Henry Johnson, a sometime congressman, senator, and governor of Louisiana, and a major plantation owner in the state of Louisiana, and one of the early subscribers and supporters of the founding of the University of the South. There were actually 5 ship voyages in all. Each voyage took about a month. They went by sea, and they ended in Algiers Parish in New Orleans. The Georgetown Memory Project has actually discovered the names of some of the ships used to transport Jesuit slaves to southern Louisiana, both in connection with the 1838 sale and also in connection with some smaller preliminary sales that took place in the early and the mid-1830s. These ships included the Tribune, the Uncas, and the Isaac Franklin. All 3 of these ships were owned at one time by the slave trading firm of Franklin and Armfield. In fact, the Tribune was actually under the ownership of Franklin and Armfield when it was used to transport a small number of Jesuit slaves to Louisiana in the mid-1830s. I mention this in passing because Franklin and Armfield was founded, of course, by John Armfield, who was one of the founders of the University of the South. The GU 272 did not settle into happy, contented lives in southern Louisiana. I think it's very, very important to say that. But fortunately, a contemporary source has said it as well. In 1848, a Maryland Jesuit accidentally crossed paths with a large group of former Georgetown slaves on a plantation in Ascension Parish. He was actually having dinner with the plantation owner as a guest, and during dinner, apparently, he noticed over his shoulder a large assemblage of people, and he recognized them. He recognized them as people who had once been enslaved by the Jesuits in Maryland, and he apparently talked to them. And here's what he wrote about the people he met. Quote, "They have scarcely any chance to attend to their religious duties. Some of the women told me, weeping, that they had not been to church for more than a year. Their children grow up without any notion of religion. These good people are now utterly neglected. This is the last eyewitness report of the GU-272 in southern Louisiana. Between 1848 and 2015, nobody from Georgetown University or the Maryland Jesuits ever went looking for the GU-272 or their descendants in southern Louisiana. No one. Not a single time. Not once. Not ever. The GU-272 had literally been pushed down the memory hole. They had been murdered, in a sense, twice. Once in body and once in name. Sorry about that. Jesuit slaveholding remained largely forgotten until just a few years ago. In the fall of 2015, students at Georgetown University organized protests to demand the renaming of 2 campus buildings. Now, these buildings were actually very, very old and located in the most historic part of campus. They were named after 2 university presidents. In fact, they were named after 2 Roman Catholic priests. Specifically, the 2 priests who sold the GU-272 to southern Louisiana in 1838. Now, it had never been a secret at Georgetown that Georgetown and the Jesuits owned slaves in its early years. But really, practically speaking, for almost everybody at Georgetown in the modern era, the details were very fuzzy. In 2015, this sort of spontaneous grassroots student protest movement actually brought this history into high-definition focus. The students really deserve a tremendous amount of credit for this. They really put a high-def gloss, if you will, on the whole history. And, again, to summarize, they made clear to people that Georgetown and the Jesuits sold 272 men, women, and children, and the sale was ordered by 2 particular Roman Catholic priests. The slaves were sold all at once and all together, and they were sold to 3 separate sugar plantations located in southern Louisiana. This was much more precision than most people at Georgetown had ever absorbed before about this particular transaction. The student protesters, being student protesters, had a list of demands. From afar, as a Georgetown alumnus, I noticed that all of the demands were about Georgetown itself. They were focused on things like building names and commemorative plaques and campus-wide educational events, the script for the campus tour, sensitivity training for GU professors and new faculty hires. Georgetown's president, around the same time, had established an official working group to investigate the 1838 sale and what it all meant for Georgetown today. As a Georgetown alumnus watching this from afar and following it in the national media, I had a sinking feeling that everybody at Georgetown was really sort of more focused on the GU than the 272, if you see what I mean. So, I'm nobody. I'm not powerful. I'm not important. I'm not influential at the university. I love Georgetown very much, and I've been, an active supporter for almost 40 years now, but essentially nobody. But I sent an email to a senior member of the Georgetown Working Group, and I asked a single question. Actually, my question had nothing to do with Georgetown University. My question was this: what happened to the people? What happened to the 272 men, women, and children who were sold to southern Louisiana in 1838? A few hours later, even though I'm nobody, I actually received a reply by email, and here's what the email said. And I'm quoting, "Dear Richard, as far as we can tell, all of them quickly succumbed to a fever in the malodorous swamp world of Louisiana." In other words, and now I'm paraphrasing, in other words, they left no trace and no descendants. And as soon as I read that, I thought, that's simply not possible. I mean, even the Titanic had survivors. Anyway, that was the day the Georgetown Memory Project was born. Just a little bit about the Georgetown Memory Project. The Georgetown Memory Project is an independent, nonprofit research institute. Our mission is to identify and locate the GU-272 ancestors, the people who were sold in 1838, and to trace their direct descendants, living and deceased. Our work is carried out by a team of 10 professional genealogists. I'm not one. I'm not a genealogist of any kind, but I work with people who are. We actually do our work in the courthouses, churches, libraries, and archives of southern Louisiana and southern Maryland. We receive no financial support whatsoever from Georgetown University or the Maryland Jesuits. We're funded entirely by the generosity of individual donors who make small contributions. If you're interested in learning more about the Georgetown Memory Project, please visit our website at www.georgetownmemoryproject.org. Over the past 4 years, we have positively identified and located 227 of the original members of the GU-272. Again, the people known as the GU-272 ancestors. These were the people who were supposed to have all just immediately died of a fever in Louisiana. For each of these people, we have established a first and last name, and we can say with precision and specificity where they ended up after the 1838 sale and where they lived in the years and even decades thereafter. So here's what we know, just some of what we know about the GU-272 ancestors as a group. Clearly, there was no mass extinction of the Georgetown slaves. 182 of them appear in the documentary record at least once at some point after 1838, but before 1865. 95 of them survived the Civil War. At least 8 of them served in the Civil War as Union soldiers. At least 21 of them survived into the 20th century. In fact, the last surviving GU-272 ancestor died in 1924. Against all odds, we actually discovered actual photographs of one of the GU-272 ancestors. What you see on the screen is are photographs of an actual person sold by Georgetown University to southern Louisiana in 1838. This is Frank Campbell. Frank Campbell was 24 years old when the Jesuits sold him to a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. Frank Campbell remained enslaved until 1865. He married another member of the GU-272, and they had children. Frank Campbell remained Roman Catholic his entire life. This picture was taken in about 1906 when Frank Campbell was 92 years old, still living and working on a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. Actually, the little girl, the smaller of the two girls, in the center of the photograph is Frank Campbell's granddaughter, Mary Jane Campbell Saunders. Mary Jane Campbell Saunders died at the age of 99 at her home in Berkeley, California in the year 2003. I actually received a telephone call from a woman who was descended from Mary Jane Campbell Saunders, and she knew Mary Jane Campbell Saunders. The woman who called me was in her 30s and was actually quite close to her and knew her years before her death in 2003. So it's interesting to note that we're that close. That's how close we are to the people who are enslaved. I received a phone call from a woman who's pictured in this photograph with one of the Georgetown slaves. That's how close we are. Of course, our research has not been limited to the GU-272 ancestors. We produce Mayflower quality genealogical research as well on the family trees. To date, as Professor Register mentioned, we have traced and verified 8,682 direct GU-272 descendants living and deceased. We find about, on average, about 200 a month, and that seems to show no signs of abating anytime soon. More than 4,000 of these descendants are alive today. Actually, hundreds of GU-272 descendants live within just a few miles of the plantations where their enslaved ancestors were sent in 1838. The GU-272 descendants include people from all walks of life, all economic, social, and educational levels. They are members and adherents of the Catholic religion, other religions, and no religion at all. This is a photograph of one member of the GU-272, but I thought I'd show you several, many photographs of the descendants. In all, the Georgetown Memory Project has reconnected more than 1,000 modern-day nuclear families, both with their historical roots and with each other. Last year, I attended a family reunion of GU-272 descendants in southern Louisiana. More than 600 direct descendants attended. And it became clear at that gathering that the GU-272 descendants have a saying, and the saying is, they tried to bury us. They did not know we were seeds. We even discovered an entire town in southern Louisiana filled with GU-272 descendants. We didn't really discover them. They knew they were there all along. It's just that we didn't know they were there, so I want to qualify that. Anyway, the town is called Maringouin, and it's located in Iberville Parish in southern Louisiana. Now, Maringouin is Cajun French for mosquito, so you can probably guess what Maringouin is like. It's a little town in the country. It's about 45 minutes from Baton Rouge, and it sits right up against the Bayou Maringouin. I mean, it's literally a backwater. But Maringouin is just about a mile from one of the 3 sugar plantations that became home to the GU-272 in 1838. 1,100 people live in Maringouin today, so 1,100 people. More than 900 of them are related to the Georgetown slaves. It's basically an entire town that only existed because after the Civil War, people walked off the plantation and walked a few miles and founded a town. Many of the GU-272 ancestors are actually buried in a small Catholic cemetery in Maringouin. The GMP has located actual grave sites and even tombstones for many of them. Today, Maringouin is a tidy and pleasant little town, lots of churches. It's also very poor. The average per capita income is about $10,000 per year, and the average household income is about $20,000 per year. Maringouin doesn't have a high school. It did. It once had a high school, but it was closed during the segregation era. The powers that be had concluded that you didn't have to desegregate a high school if it didn't exist, so they simply shut it down, and it's never been reopened. That was true, I believe, across the South. When I asked my friends in Maringouin if they thought Georgetown should build them a high school, they said no. When I said, well, college prep? They said no. And I asked a series of questions, and they kept saying no. So finally, I did what I really should have done in the first place, which was to ask them what they thought Georgetown should do for them. And when I finally asked that question, what they wanted, their answer shocked me. They said, Wi-Fi. Maybe Georgetown can help us get Wi-Fi. We want our children to be able to look at the internet. We want them to know there is an entire world out there. Since 2015, the Descendent Factor has produced a pretty substantial impact at Georgetown and in the world beyond. The Jesuits have formally apologized to the GU-272 descendants for their role in slavery. Georgetown University itself has granted legacy admissions preference to the descendants of people once enslaved by the Maryland Jesuits. Now, this is not a guarantee of admission to Georgetown, and it's definitely not a scholarship or a grant of financial aid. It's a leg up in the admissions process. So basically, GU-272 descendants now receive the same admissions edge that was traditionally accorded and has always traditionally been accorded to the children of Georgetown alumni faculty, staff, and major benefactors. To date, 7 GU 272 descendants, including the 3 pictured here, have enrolled at Georgetown. 4 of them are undergraduates, 2 are graduate students, and 1 has been admitted to the Georgetown University School of Medicine. So far, the admissions rate in the GU 272 legacy admissions pool is 50%. The admissions rate in the general pool, if you just apply at Georgetown, is about 14%. So, I mean, it's actually, it's real. It's a substantial benefit. The latest descendant admitted to Georgetown is a young woman from New Orleans. She's a transfer student to the Undergraduate School of Business, and she's studying marketing. She is a descendant of an astonishing 10 members of the original GU 272. In April 2019, the undergraduate student body, again acting on its own volition, without any outside prompting or interference, approved a referendum to make financial reparations to the GU 272 descendant community out of their own pockets. To become effective, the proposal has to be ratified by the university's board of directors, and the university's board has not yet acted on it, but the hard part has been done. This is the first time in U.S. history that students at a major American university have voted to pay reparations to the descendants of people enslaved by their alma mater. Specifically, the Georgetown undergraduate student body voted to create what they call a GU 272 Reconciliation Trust to be funded through a compulsory reconciliation fee, like a student activities fee, but for the express purpose of reconciliation, to be charged to every Georgetown undergraduate every semester in perpetuity. The reconciliation fee was initially set at $27.20 per semester, which is actually 1/10 of semester tuition. So it's really a very small nominal amount. It will be indexed to inflation. The reconciliation fee will generate approximately $415,000 per year. The preamble to the referendum reads in part as follows. I think this is worth quoting. It says, quote, as students at an elite institution, we recognize the great privileges we have been given, and we wish to at least partially repay our debts to those families whose involuntary sacrifices made these privileges possible. As individuals with moral imagination, we choose to do more than simply recognize the past. We resolve to change our future. Also in the text of the referendum that students were asked to vote on was the specification that the funds must be used for, quote, charitable purposes directly benefiting the descendants of the GU 272 and other persons once enslaved by the Maryland Jesuits, with special consideration given to causes and proposals directly benefiting those descendants still residing in communities such as Maringouin, Louisiana. Now, personally, I thought there was no chance this referendum would pass. I thought maybe it would attract the support of 30 or 40% of the Georgetown undergraduate student body. The referendum passed 67% to 33%. And it passed in a student election that generated the highest voter, sorry, I'm choking up. It passed in a student election that generated the highest voter participation in decades. I'd actually now like to turn my attention to a more general discussion of universities and slavery reparations. Of course, Georgetown University is just one of many U.S. colleges with a legacy connection to slavery. Here's a dozen prominent universities that were closely involved in the antebellum slave trade. I want to just pause and point out to Professor Register that Sewanee is actually listed here. But really, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Slavery was the internet of its day. It was the national business model for more than 2 centuries. In reality, hundreds of educational institutions operating in the United States today have significant economic ties to slavery. Here are some facts and figures about four-year colleges and universities operating in the United States today. 111 colleges operating today were founded before 1861 just in states that were part of the Confederacy or border states. 323 colleges operating today were founded before 1861 in the entire United States. Now, 239 of these are private, and 148 are religious. 709 colleges operating today were founded in the U.S. before 1890. Basically, there are only 3,000, about 3,000 four-year colleges and universities operating in the entire United States today. More than 700 of them were founded before 1890, so well within the economic plume of antebellum slavery-based economy. That's almost 25%. So the problem isn't limited to a small number of specific colleges, and neither is the solution. But for now, let's note that American higher education today rests on the economic foundations of slavery. When it comes to assessing institutional culpability for slavery, I think nuance matters. Not all institutions were complicit in slavery to the same degree. This point, I think, becomes relevant when we start imagining institutional responses to legacy connections to slavery. In a sense, it actually becomes incumbent on us to create a calculus of complicity, a taxonomy of evil, a moral scale that recognizes and calibrates complicity in wrongdoing. Here, on the screen, I've suggested just one possible scale of institutional complicity. The levels are arranged in descending order at the top down to the bottom, arranged from sort of alarming to truly appalling. So at the top, and I'll sort of just briefly walk you through this, you get the point. At the top are sort of, gifts. Large donations were accepted from slave owners and traffickers when the university was founded or during its existence. Level 8, proceeding towards the heart of darkness, significant honors were conferred on slave owners and traffickers. Level 7, forced labor was used on campus, including in construction projects and, perhaps in many cases, the construction of important campus buildings or any campus building. Level 6, getting deeper. Enslaved people were given or accepted as a form of payment. Payment for tuition, payment for goods and services, etc. Level 5, enslaved people were bought, sold, or rented by the institution. So the institution itself engaged in human trafficking. Level 4 is mass ownership. This is more common than you might realize. That large-scale slave plantations were owned by the institution. And this happened in the North as well as in the South, and it even happened after emancipation. You have northern universities accepting ownership of slave plantations in Cuba, Barbados, or South America, managed in absentia after emancipation. Exploitation, that enslaved people were used for experiments, medical experiments, and other pseudoscientific undertakings. Level 2 is documented instances of violence that enslaved people were abused, attacked, tortured, or murdered in connection with the institution. And level 1, Georgetown got all the way to level 1, is ideology, that the institution itself actively defended, advocated, and promoted the institution of slavery. It's just a model, but it's a way of sort of grappling in a nuanced way with alma mater's complicity in the slave trade. And I think, just to nuance it just slightly further, I think when assessing institutional culpability, it's also useful, I think, to determine precisely who within the university engaged in this type of conduct. I think, again, we can disagree about these things, but we can also discuss them. That institutional culpability may be greatest when the institution itself was the bad actor, and culpability may be mitigated or least when it was third-party donors who were to blame. In any event, it's useful to sort of analyze just how widespread and how deep the wrongdoing really was. I mean, if we're really going to examine more than 700 institutions, I think some sort of nuanced analysis is worthwhile. Just as an example, here's an institutional scorecard for Georgetown University. These scores are real. They're based on my considered understanding of historical fact and circumstances at Georgetown, and I think this scorecard demonstrates why Georgetown has indeed become ground zero for the modern day debate over reparations for university-sponsored slavery. You can see that Georgetown was deeply complicit in the antebellum slave trade, and that this complicity really involved every level and every segment of the university, today what we would call stakeholders. But, you know, this framework is not Georgetown specific. You can do this at home. This is actually a game the whole family can play, and I encourage you to develop a scorecard for your own alma mater. This is also, I think, a good time to squarely address the big question: what should the present do for future generations to mitigate the sins of the past? Excuse me. I'd actually like to propose an answer for your consideration that's simple without being simplistic. Really, when you're considering this question, there are really only three possible answers. There's everything, there's nothing, and there's something. Now, nobody is seriously entertaining the first option, everything. Nobody has seriously proposed that a major American university be liquidated for its complicity in slavery, with the proceeds to be distributed among the descendants of enslaved people. Since the end of the Civil War, the mainstream default position has been the other extreme: nothing. So when we ask ourselves, what should we do about our university's complicity in slavery, involvement in the slave trade, we say nothing. Our university should do nothing. Now, when I say nothing, I should tell you that I do include even small, symbolic, on-campus gestures, like, sort of list them, things like issuing public apologies, erecting plaques and small memorials, commissioning plays and public performances, conducting research and fact-finding, hiring archivists, renaming campus buildings, revising the script for the campus tour, and enhancing the undergraduate curriculum. We'll talk about these in just a bit, in some more depth. But, to me, collectively, I sort of describe these types of measures as comprising the arts and crafts school of reparations. I describe them as nothing, which I realize is provocative, but I describe them as nothing because they literally do nothing for the people and communities most directly affected and impacted by antebellum slavery, which are the descendants of the enslaved people and the communities that have cared for them since emancipation. By definition, those people and communities have been placed almost entirely beyond the pale and protection of the elite academic institutions that sort of loudly trumpet these mostly symbolic gestures. Status quo initiatives are almost always carefully designed to benefit the slave-owning institution itself, and small amounts of money are simply moved from one pocket at the university to another. Anyway, this brings me to my preferred option, which is something. What should the present do for future generations to mitigate the sins of alma mater's past? Something. We should do something. In a few moments, I'll actually describe what I think something might look like, but for right now, I'd actually like to focus briefly on the profound significance of doing something to mitigate the sins of alma mater's past. Doing something would actually be a monumental step of historic proportions. It would require courage, wisdom, generosity, and grace. To do something, we have to want to do something. We have to actively choose something over nothing. I'm an entrepreneur by profession and temperament, and I can tell you that the hardest gap to close is the gap between 0 and 1. And I can also tell you that something always beats nothing every single time. Now, as I just promised, I'd actually like to describe, for your consideration, what something might look like. I can't describe a one-size-fits-all reparations program. Nobody can do that. As we discussed, different institutions have different historical relationships with slavery, and each institution ultimately has to fashion its own approach. But I would like to suggest 6 guiding principles that I think all institutions should adopt. If you wish, you're welcome to call these guidelines the Cellini principles. Sadly, they have no finer providence than that, and if you adopt them, they can become the Sewanee principles or the Register principles. But for now, unfortunately, they're the Cellini principles. Principle number 1, reparations can and should be voluntary. Too often, I think the reparations debate is framed in legal or even contractual terms: debts owed, rights violated, crimes committed. It doesn't have to be this way. We are free to break the frame. We are not required to think of reparations as a matter of legal obligation. We can understand them instead as a form of generosity, investment, imagination, creativity, or goodwill. Let's actually not debate what we owe. Let's discuss who we are, and better yet, who we love. Actually, breaking the legalistic frame is liberating. There's actually no statute of limitations for acts of generosity. No logic is required for acts of creativity, compassion, or love. It's important for me to note that when I say voluntary, I don't mean optional, at least not at the individual level. I'm not suggesting that institutions should just pass the hat and let individuals contribute as much or as little as they like, whenever they like, or not at all. I'm actually suggesting that reparations should be adopted in a voluntary fashion at the institutional level, and once adopted, they should become binding and compulsory on all members of the institution until the policy is abolished or amended. We do this all the time. I mean, that's what the honor code came from, and parking regulations, and our choice of school colors, and the alma mater. We make voluntary institutional decisions, and they are binding until amended or abolished. Actually, in the end, I think reparations are no less significant or meaningful because they have been adopted voluntarily. And indeed, I think there's a very strong argument that they become more significant and meaningful because they are freely chosen. In the private sphere, at least, the most important commitments we make are the ones we make voluntarily. As Tevius says in Fiddler on the Roof, either just before or just after singing the song tradition, why do we do these things? Because we want to. You know, at some level, the entire debate over university slavery reparations comes down to this single point. Not what do we have to do, but what do we want to do? Second, I believe reparations should be proportionate. I mean that they should be comparable in size, scope, and duration to the original wrong they are meant to redress. Of course, it's impossible to overstate the magnitude and enormity of antebellum slavery. Between 1620 and 1865, approximately 9 to 10 million people were enslaved at some point in the territory known today as the United States, and approximately 4 million people were enslaved at the time of the emancipation. The effects of slavery reverberate down into the present day, economically, socially, legally, culturally. White families in America have nearly 10 times the net worth of black families, and the gap is growing. As we've already discussed, in the modern era, universities have tended to respond to their historical connections to slavery with symbolic on-campus gestures. I've referred to them as nothing. It does seem churlish to object to these measures, and yet object we must. On what grounds should we object to these? We should object because they are disproportionately small in comparison to the evil they are meant to redress. These gestures may be necessary, but they are not sufficient. By themselves, they're inadequate. They are not even half measures. Now, it's incorrect to say that these measures are no good. They're just not good enough. And I think we have to have the courage and clarity of mind and heart to say so when the circumstances demand. Principle number 3, I think reparations should be remedial. Specifically, reparations should be made to those to whom injury has been done. Universities have a duty to fashion remedies that directly benefits descendants and the communities in which they presently live. Now, this principle may seem obvious, but it's also the first one violated. Probably because it's the easiest and most tempting one to violate. Universities often convince themselves that the right thing to do for slavery's victims is to enrich the very institution that once profited from slavery in the first place. They will even go out and solicit millions and millions of dollars in new grant money for the purpose. In my view, this is a modern-day manifestation of the privilege and superiority that once led universities to support the slave trade in the first place. Yet again, the needs of black families are subordinated to the higher mission of the university. I think we must be vigilant about resisting this impulse. I call it the polite, white sleight of hand. University complicity in slavery is not about universities. It's about slavery. Universities should not pay reparations to themselves, even future enlightened versions of themselves. Reparations requires more than just shifting funds from one campus budget to another. Again, I believe justice should be rendered to those to whom injustice has been done. Principle 4, reparations should be equivalent to the harm originally inflicted. This is not about the proportionality principle. We already talked about this. This is instead more about, the form in which reparations should be paid. Money is what was taken from enslaved people and their families, among other things, and so money is what must be paid as restitution. Critics of reparations have a habit of sneering and saying dismissively, it's all about the money. My response is this. From the very beginning, slavery has always been about the money. There's no reason to stop now. Sometimes university administrators will say to me, this could wind up costing us money. And I say, yes, it almost certainly will. During the question and answer period, if you want to ask me how much I think it should cost Sewanee, I'll be happy to answer you. I think we need to be upfront about this. We need to stop treating money as a taboo subject, and we have to be vigilant for another variant of the polite white sleight of hand. Invariably, somebody in a position of authority and power will say, universities should make reparations by doing what universities do best. And everybody at the meeting will murmur, yes, exactly so. But reparations should not be tailored to the aptitudes, skills, preferences, or resources of the wrongdoers. When oil companies pollute the environment, nobody says oil companies should make reparations by doing what oil companies do best, which I guess is discovering new sources of energy and giving us handsome discounts at the pump. Nobody says that. We have to resist the temptation, once again, to put the university and its particular charism and preferences and skills at the center of the story in a position of privilege. We have to put the victims at the center of the story. And frankly, universities are actually pretty good at standing on the sidelines, raising money, and writing checks. Principle number 5, I think reparations should be developed in collaboration with injured parties. Intended beneficiaries should be included in the development and design process from the very beginning as full partners in the enterprise, and they should remain involved over the long term. We should ask people for their advice and recommendations and input, and those answers should be respected. I wish I could actually leave this item without further comment because it seems obvious enough and it seems tedious to be talking further about this, and yet universities actually don't play well with others. They just don't. Now, I want to make an exception, actually, for the University of the South. It is actually astonishing that Professor Register and his colleagues invited an outsider, somebody like me, a non-academic, to be here to speak. I think at this point he's probably deeply regretting his choice. This university is an exception to the general rule. You and your leaders, including your Vice Chancellor, and the members of the working group have actually already demonstrated a deep personal commitment to involving other people and reaching quote-unquote, outside the university. But in general, universities actually don't play well with others. For example, Georgetown's official working group actually never included a single member of the descendant community, not even after hundreds of them had been discovered and publicly identified. In general, I think universities tend to treat non-academics as outsiders, and they all tend to study proposals at great length and then just sort of spring them on people without much advance notice. This is not a strategy for success. The final principle I'd like to share is that I do think reparations should be coordinated, at least at some point. I think specifically they should be designed to reinforce, amplify, extend remedies adopted by others, including other institutions. Clearly, slavery transcended institutional boundaries, and it makes sense for remedies and responses to do so as well. Again, in the modern era, we're sort of not quite there yet. There's still this tendency to place the university at the center of the story. We tend to focus on Georgetown slaves, or Harvard slaves, or UVA slaves. And remedies, even symbolic ones, are tied to specific universities. They just are. Legacy admissions preference at Georgetown, free tuition at the Virginia Theological Seminary, and an on-campus slavery memorial at Brown. It's almost as though we're saying, and I sort of feel somewhat guilty of this myself, these are not just any slaves. These are Georgetown slaves. Or even better, these are Ivy League slaves. But, this doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make any sense to organize slavery reparations by college, and it makes even less sense to organize them by football conference. I think universities can and should work together to pool resources and remedies. The world really would be a better place if just one university, or maybe a small group of universities, took up this challenge and led the effort to create sort of an intercollegiate framework for slavery reparations. I've already said that more than 700 colleges operating today were founded before 1890, and as you know from the media, Virginia Theological Seminary recently announced the creation of a $1.7 million reparations fund for the descendants of enslaved people. But if all 700 colleges each donated the relatively modest sum of $1.7 million to a single foundation for racial transformation and healing, actually that foundation would have $1.2 billion in capital. It would instantly become one of the 30 richest foundations in the United States and one of the 40 richest foundations in the world. Now that I've told you what I think universities should do about their complicity in the slave trade, I'd like to briefly tell you why I think they should do it. Specifically, I want to present reasons for, and I think there are people here asking the question, well, yes, you've said they should do something and even said what something should look like, but why should we assume responsibility for the past? I mean, this is a non-trivial question. This is controversial. People say, but why? And so I've decided to tell you the what first and the why second, and I think that's the right way to present this material. If I did it the other way around and talked about why first, you actually wouldn't know if you were on a bridge or a plank. And by doing this way, I hope you're at least, feel like you're on a bridge, but if not, you at least know where the plank is leading. I've already sort of told you, about as much as I'm going to tell you about what reparations should look like, and now I want to sort of talk just a little more about the why, because, we all have questions about this, and we all have debates with ourselves and each other about this. We need to grapple with this. We need to answer the question. We're going to do this just to be nice or because, I don't know, be a good idea. I mean, there needs to be a why. You are fiduciaries and you have competing budget obligations and resources are scarce and money is not endless. So we need to really dig in on why. First, I think slavery is not a thing of the past for the descendants of enslaved people. We often hear that the past is the past, that slavery happened a long time ago on plantations far, far away. No one alive today was ever enslaved. No living person ever bought or sold slaves, and this has nothing to do with us. Now, in my view, it's foolish to talk about slavery as being in the past, especially for the descendants of people who were enslaved. 4 million people were enslaved in the United States at the time of the Emancipation, and the last survivors of American slavery lived until the 1950s and the 1960s. We are literally only one generation removed from slavery. There are millions of people today who knew people who were enslaved in America. They know close relatives who were enslaved in America. For Black Americans, slavery isn't just the past, it's the present and much of the future as well. Racism is the living, beating heart of American slavery, and racism is what we lawyers would call an intergenerational tort or injury. It's an evil that is inflicted not just on a group of individuals, but upon their descendants as well. Racism doesn't just happen to be intergenerational, it's designed to be intergenerational. Intergenerational harm is the whole point of racism. Racism really is the poison that the past has injected into the present to cause deliberate harm in the future. We should not be surprised that slavery is not a thing of the past for the descendants of enslaved people. If our families, meaning white families, were repeatedly broken apart, our children taken from us, our spouses raped, and our wealth stolen from us just 150 years ago, I'm pretty sure we'd all still be talking about it. I know my family would. Likewise, we shouldn't be surprised that the effects of slavery shape the present and much of the future. Advantages accumulate over time, and especially disadvantages. Second, and I think this is particularly important to the University of the South and Georgetown, slavery isn't a thing of the past for anybody else either. Saying that slavery has nothing to do with us isn't a reason for rejecting reparations. It's actually a conclusion, and it's an incorrect conclusion at that. We are all the direct beneficiaries of slavery in a tangible economic sense. Everything around us rests on the broad, solid, nearly unshakable economic foundations of slavery. We are warming ourselves by fires we did not build, and we are drinking from wells we did not dig. This is especially true of universities and their students, faculty, and alumni. As almost everybody in this room knows, the Latin word universitas does not mean universal, it means corporation. Universities are continuous bodies with perpetual existence. The universities that benefited from slavery are the same ones we attend today. If you don't think that today's university is the same one that generated wealth and property from slavery more than 150 years ago, try taking it. Try saying, oh, that land or that building or that endowment, that's not really yours because you're not the same university you were 150 years ago. I think you'll find out that they really are. Anyway, when it flatters us, we have no problem seeing ourselves as the direct successors of those who went before us. And I'm deeply sympathetic to people who are very, very proud of the University of the South or Georgetown or Harvard or any of these institutions. We should be we should see ourselves as the direct successors of those who went before us. We should be proud of that. We are in a very long tradition, a very long distinguished tradition of moral and intellectual reasoning. That is nowhere more true than it is at the University of the South. But we must also have the intellectual integrity and honesty to recognize ourselves as their successors when it shames us as well. In fact, I think we should be wary of anyone who claims that slavery is a thing of the past and best forgotten. You know, in my experience, villains always want to forget the past. It's really only the heroes who want to remember it. Oh gosh, Woody, this is provocative. I'm not sure. I guess I'm going to keep going here. Another reason that I think we need to do this is because racism is a white problem that white people need to fix. I think the word reparations is subtly misleading. It suggests that black people are somehow damaged and that white people should do something to repair them. I think instead of reparations, we should probably use a word like restitution, the restoration of what has been stolen to its rightful owners. White people can't repair black people, and indeed, they do not need to be repaired. White people, many of us, need to be repaired, and the society and culture we've built needs to be repaired. I think we have to say that. Racism is a mental defect or disease that primarily infects the minds of white people. It's a delusion so massive and widespread that it has the power to shape and distort reality. It can not just degrade lives, but destroy them as well. Black people must constantly contend with this mass delusion without ever losing sight about the truth of themselves. It's exhausting. Black people are the victims of racism. They're not the parties to it, and they're certainly not the cause of it. It's our responsibility, it's the responsibility of the majority culture to cure ourselves and our society of this disease. And we have no reason to expect the victims to cure us or even to persuade us or negotiate with us to effectuate a cure. Fourth, I think I'd like to make the case that making reparations isn't just something we're doing for them, it's actually something we're doing for us. It's something we're doing for all of us. In fact, there is no us and them, there's only us. You know, American history is black history, and black history is American history. Their story is our story, and our story is their story. You know, it just gives a little example. It's almost sort of a little secret. You know, I've come to learn that the phrase Black Lives Matter is kind of a Rorschach test. To our black brothers and sisters, it's actually just a simple declaration of fact. Black Lives Matter. And the sensible, obvious answer is just yes, Black Lives Matter. Not all lives matter, or blue lives matter, or white lives matter too. It's just a statement like grass is green. The sensible answer is yes, grass is green. We don't say all plants are green and some shamrocks are green. We just say yes, grass is green. But why do some of us have such a hard time affirming such an obvious statement of fact? I think in the end, it's all about who's in the circle and who isn't. You know, it's true that families make shared sacrifices, but it's also true that shared sacrifices make families. When we sacrifice for someone, we're not just saying who we are, but also who we love. We mustn't think of reparations as something we are paying to them. We must think of it as a gift we are giving to ourselves and to our children and our grandchildren. Really, the only question is how generous we are willing to be with ourselves as a society, and whether we are humble enough to both make and accept this gift in the first place. Fifth, I think we should do this because it's time. Black families in this country are unimaginably old. They have shaped America and what it means to be an American. They have been here for 400 years. And how much longer should racial healing wait? In fact, why should it wait any additional time at all? People often ask, do we have to talk about this now? And for me, the answer is yes. Yes, we have to speak about it now. Shout about it, actually. It's time to make additional progress on racial healing. And finally, I think we should do this because we can. We can do this. Voluntary reparations is not a question of capacity or resources. We are very, very rich, not least because we have grown fat off the spoils of centuries of racial injustice. We have the resources to do this, And we actually don't need anybody's permission to make reparations. We're talking about voluntary reparations made by private institutions operating in a free country. As we so often love to boast, we can do anything we want and nobody can stop us. So the question isn't really whether we can shoulder responsibility for the sins of alma maters past. Of course we can. For me, the question isn't even why would we shoulder this responsibility. The better question really is, why wouldn't we? In conclusion, I'd like to share some brief but candid thoughts about Sewanee and voluntary slavery reparations. Now, to absolutely nobody's surprise here, I urge Sewanee to do something by way of reparations. And these reparations should be voluntary, proportionate, remedial, equivalent, inclusive, and coordinated. Sewanee is not the first university to grapple with its complicity in the slave trade. Some universities have responded poorly. Some universities have responded adequately. I think Sewanee should respond magnificently. The case for doing something at Sewanee isn't liberal or left-wing. This is not a liberal or left-wing idea because actually I don't have any liberal or left-wing ideas. I just don't. That's not me. My case, which I will share with you in just a few moments, is actually deeply conservative, and it's rooted in the oldest and finest traditions of this university. I think the case for embracing reparations at Sewanee is radical, but only in the original sense of the word, that it's tied to the roots of the University of the South. First, I think Sewanee should take a leadership role on this issue precisely because the university has been so deeply connected to the institution of slavery for so very, very long. It's not my purpose to provide a detailed recitation of the facts and circumstances of Sewanee's involvement in the slave trade. I think, a high-level summary will do, and here I'm quoting from Professor Register's text of an online exhibit called Founded to Make Men, Explorations of Masculinity at the University of the South. He writes, quote, "What distinguished the University of the South was the centrality of slavery to the founders' conception of the man the nation and region needed. All of the founders were of one mind on the subject of slavery. The Constitution upheld it. It was not just legal and moral, but right in the eyes of God. The manly Christian patriots of the University of the South were to bear and defend those truths before the nation and the world. The University of the South was the only institution of higher education in the United States expressly designed and launched by and for a modern plantation slave economy and society." Separately, I'd actually like to quote from a letter written by Bishop Leonidas Polk, the driving force behind the founding of the University of the South. On July 1st, 1856, Polk sent a letter to his fellow slave-holding bishops, urging them to join him in constructing a university that would produce scholarship, quote, "for the defense and maintenance of our distinctive principles." My point is this. The University of the South has always had distinctive ideas and principles about slavery. For God's sake, don't stop now. By all means, switch sides, or, the institution has switched sides, but, reject the errors of the past. But the tide has turned. The nation is undergoing a massive re-examination of slavery and its continuing legacy in America today. This is not the time for Sewanee to suddenly go silent on the question of slavery. I think, in a very real way, talking with a number of your students, what could be more wonderful than Slavery's University to serve in a leadership role of addressing university reparations for slavery? Second, I think Sewanee should take a leadership role on voluntary slavery reparations because doing so is entirely consistent with Sewanee's other founding principle. I refer, of course, to the motto Ecce Quam Bonum, adopted by the trustees at the time the university was founded. Behold how good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. EQB, as it's known here, is part of Sewanee's DNA and has been part of the university's history from the very beginning. EQB is not a trivial commitment. EQB is another one of the distinctive principles of the University of the South. It's a principle that's worthy of the labor of generations of Sewanee sons and daughters dedicated to producing scholarship and good works for its maintenance and defense. Finally, I think Sewanee should shoulder responsibility for its past for the most obvious reason of all. Sewanee is a religiously affiliated institution. Professor Craig Stephen Wilder, an MIT historian who's written extensively about universities and their ties to slavery, has noted that the national conversation is being led by the religious institutions. He says, the conversation about institutional obligations to the descendants of the enslaved typically gets confined to a discussion of research and fact-finding. Professor Wilder says, quote, "It's the religious institutions that have started to lay out a path from there towards restorative justice." He says it's much harder for religious institutions to be silent on the moral implications of their own history Now, I want to tell you, this view is entirely consistent with the experiences of the GU 272 descendants at Georgetown. In June of 2017, I sat in the old quadrangle at Georgetown with a GU 272 descendant from New Orleans. Her name is Sherilyn Branch. She's deeply Catholic, like her GU 272 ancestors. She's 65 years old, a retired school principal in a Catholic girls' school. She had traveled to Washington, D.C. from New Orleans by bus. She had done so for the sole purpose of meeting with the president of Georgetown University and also the head of the Maryland Jesuits. Now, this was literally the first time in 180 years that the leader of the Maryland Jesuits had met with anybody from the families sold south in 1838. Before the meeting, Sherilyn and I sat in Georgetown's old quadrangle, holding hands and praying, and to be honest, crying. And we were just a few yards from an ancient covered well that had surely been used on a daily basis by the GU 272 ancestors. And in a quiet moment, Sherilyn confided to me, she said, "You know, Richard, if I had learned that my ancestors had been enslaved by NYU or Princeton, it wouldn't have meant a thing to me. I feel no connection to those places." And she went on and said, "But Georgetown is a religious institution. We share the same faith. We pray to the same God. And that makes all the difference." To summarize and to close, I think Sewanee really should proactively take responsibility for its role in the antebellum slave trade for the three reasons we've talked about. Sewanee has always had an intimate attachment to the topic of slavery. Sewanee has an equally distinguished and long-standing commitment to the university of mankind. And Sewanee is a religious institution that takes moral obligations and moral ideas seriously. No institution alone or in concert with others can ever erase the harm done by centuries of slavery in North America, but we can fight the good fight. We can do the good work. In the words of Samuel Beckett, let us strive to earn the right to say, "We are not saints, but we have kept our appointment." How many people can boast as much? Thank you very much. Now, precisely because I have been provocative, I'm more than happy to take questions. In fact, I encourage doubters and skeptics and people of a different view. I'll be happy to, I'm actually most happy to learn from you and the questions you ask me, but I'll be happy to take any questions anybody might have.
Well, you won't get a skeptic out of my question, but I guess I want to return back to your proportionality and then your gradient of nothing to everything. And thinking about a university like the University of the South that ranks on the #1 on your gradient of, like ideological, thinking about the 30,000 plus people that were, enslaved by the donors, the founders, but also the harm and oppression caused by the institution, even to the students of color today. Like, how can a university ever justify its own personhood more than the personhood of all of those harmed? And so with the everything debate, I don't know if anything short of everything could ever be proportionate. So I was curious what your opinion on.
Yeah, I think, sometimes, and this is not true of you, sometimes when people ask that question, it's sort of a reason to never get started. They say, well, we'll never be able to solve this problem, so let's do nothing. I didn't at all get the sense that was your intent. A young lady asked me a similar question in class today, and again, I had the very same reaction. It was a sincere question. She wasn't using it as a dodge or a foil. I don't know how satisfactory this is. My view would be that again, as I said, at the end, we're not going to solve this problem, but we can at least keep our appointment. We're not saints. I'm certainly not. And I frequently think that if somebody who's sort of as weak a vessel as I am can do this work, then basically almost anybody can. I think it's important that we try, that we do something. And I don't think, and this was a topic that came up in class today, I don't think this is going to be transactional. This is not going to be once and done. It's not, oh, well, here you are, we've done this thing, we're good, right? Again, I think it comes back to drawing that circle and including people. And I think that I don't think we're ever going to be reconciled, because I don't think these two group of people were ever conciled in the first place. I think we're going to be, sort of truly integrated as one family if and when we all choose to do that. But like a family, we will be together in perpetuity. Often at Georgetown, people will ask me, people of goodwill will say, well, when does this end? When will they go away? And I say, well, we don't expect our dental school alumni to go away. We don't expect our football alumni to go away. We don't expect it will ever end. Once you're sort of in the Sewanee family or the Georgetown family, you're in the family, and you have ups and downs and good times and bad times, but, you're in the family. And I think it will, again, I don't think this is a very satisfactory answer, but I think it will have some of those aspects, if that makes any sense to you.
Hi, good evening to everyone. First, I want to say I certainly appreciate this opportunity to be here on behalf of my sophomore daughter here at Sewanee. And it's a great pleasure to be amongst you. I really, really love history. I was a student at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And so, of course, being there right across the street from where Martin Luther King went at Morehouse, you were just kind of immersed in history and purpose and taking risks and making sacrifices. And I really liked something very poignant that you said, and you touched base on it a couple of times, about how, I was just talking to somebody about this earlier today, how in this country we have lawmakers. I have one in my family, a Congressman, Anthony Brown from Maryland. He's married to my sister. And so people have asked me, oh, when you have these questions, take it to your brother-in-law and see what he thinks about what they're talking about over there on Capitol Hill. And one of the things that you mentioned a couple of times is we can do what we want to do. And then when we do it, we justify it. We just give a reason and we make this law and say this is the way it ought to be. So when we should start thinking about doing things right, why can't we justify that it's the right thing to do, whatever that thing is? I'm really deeply concerned also, and I have been for many, many years, about Native American Indians. Interesting that I'm standing at an institution that it seems pretty obvious to me that that's an Indian name. The nearby town, I always tell my daughter, I forget how to pronounce it, Tullahoma. That's an Indian name. If you name all of the 50 United States in this country, you will hear it. South Dakota, Idaho, Nevada, Nebraska. When are we going to own up to these things that seem pretty obvious to me? I don't know. Maybe God put it in my head and it's a spiritual awakening. But living in Fort Washington, Maryland, about 20 minutes from Georgetown University. It's pretty auspicious that I came here. Oh, I wanted to come anyhow for Parents Weekend. And but that I saw the flyers in some building here on campus to attend this. And we were supposed to be on our way to the mall at Chattanooga. And I told my daughter I would like to come to this. So I just want to say that living near Washington, D.C., having somebody in the family who's a lawmaker, living 20 minutes from Georgetown University, I am surrounded by this daily. But spiritually, I love everybody. Spiritually, I see the Christ in everybody. Spiritually, I think that Jesus keeps telling me, this isn't that difficult. You all are making it difficult. And you're trying to justify wrongs, whatever the wrong might be. And we just need to do what he said, try to see if we can justify why we should turn around and start doing things more right.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. You talked about inclusiveness with one of the processes. One thing that I've come across in some of my research is that a lot of the times when you invite those that were injured to the table, sometimes those that caused the injury dominate the decision-making process, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first level of the question.
Yeah.
How do you propose the university pull back its seat or count or representation on a board to making the decision? And then two, how are you dealing with the intra-conflicts with those who are coming from the injury group?
Yeah.
So not all blacks think alike, not all any group think alike. So you would have those that say there's no amount of money that can repair the damage, and therefore I don't want any money or I don't want any reparations. That gets complicated as well. So
yes, very much.
How do you deal with those two?
No, I mean those are very, very, very important questions, and I've been closely involved with the GU 272 descendants on both of those, and mostly I think my short answer is I don't know. We're trying. A lot of us have to try. You're absolutely on the right track, but just on your 2 points, that yes, when even it's very, very difficult for the university to establish the playing ground and the playing rules. The university, I think, has to come to the table as just, one member, one party at the table, and it's somebody else's table. In fact, the Georgetown descendants have enlisted the W.K. Kellogg Foundation as the convening and hosting entity, because it's really tripartite. It's the descendants, it's Georgetown, and the Jesuits. And the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, about a $7.5 billion foundation, has a very distinguished history and commitment of funding and working in the field of racial reconciliation and healing. So they really stepped out of their normal frame. And just on that point, I mean, again, this is not like, as I try to tell people at Georgetown, dealing with the descendants of Georgetown slaves, it's not like dealing with our football alumni or our dental alumni. I mean, this is not, it's not the same relationship. They're never going to, and nor should they, sort of slot in under the, organizational leadership and power structure of the university that enslaved their ancestors. I mean, the last time they did that, it didn't work out so well. So, I mean, they're not going to start trusting you now, and shouldn't. I mean, it's just too much. It has to be done in the way we were discussing. And the second point about, the descendant community doesn't all want the same thing. That's absolutely true. Some descendants say about reparations, I will not be a party to my ancestors being sold a second time. That's a very powerful statement. Some people are swayed by the idea that the money would be put in a charitable foundation, but I think it's a very serious and challenging set of issues. I sort of come at the question a little bit obliquely. I don't precisely have an answer, but I do have a position on it, which is, my advice to Georgetown and the Jesuits has been, deal with it. They don't all think alike. You enslaved 1,000 people for 250 years. There are now probably 10,000 of their descendants, and guess what? They don't all think the same thing. Why should they? There are a lot of smart people at Georgetown. There are a lot of smart people at Sewanee. There are foundations. I mean, we just have to take these things seriously, and we just have to deal with it. So I don't know how to deal with it yet, but these are very important points.
Maybe one last question.
You said in your lecture Ask me about this later. To be very blunt, how much does Sewanee owe?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to give you an answer. First of all, I will say I don't frame this in terms of what people owe, but in terms of what do we want to do. If I were spending Sewanee's money, which I'd be happy to do, and I'm glad the Vice Chancellor has left, and I don't really know where this number comes from, but I think it's 50 million to 100 million. It's not trivial. I know what your endowment is. I know, a lot about this university from having done my homework. It's not trivial. 50 to 100 million dollars can do a lot of good in the world. And of course, Sewanee would remain somehow connected with it and involved with it. I mean, again, this is not transactional, but it's about it's about a shared investment in the future. And just off the top of my head, as a businessman and somebody who's been thinking about this particular issue for 4 years, I think we're talking about, it cost about $100 million to start a new school at Georgetown University, a new graduate school. So I think we're talking about sort of something on that scale or magnitude. It's just my view. Other people, I'm sure, have different views. Yes, ma'am. Yes. So because she didn't have the microphone, she's saying that her understanding is that a lot of those pledges that were pledged to the university did not actually come in. Again, I'll answer this as a businessman. This is a collections issue. This is the university's problem. The fact that it did not actually receive the money is really, to me, morally of no account. The university and its sponsors essentially collateralized the lives of 30,000 to 60,000 people to make this university possible. And that, to me, is the pivotal moral moment. Everything else, to me, is a collections issue.
Please join me in thanking Richard.